Thank you for inspiring speeches and intriguing questions. Since the session was called National Modernisms, I would like to start from the question to Karina, but maybe it's a broader question for other speakers who can join the discussion. Because from all of your talks we can see that there are some functional typology of buildings that were more important to be the national idiom than others. And for example, from the Karina's example, I see that sanatorium buildings were not very much involved in this national construction, because it's either functionalist or manor style, and we know that manor style as German style was not very much important in building the national style of Latvia. Maybe I'm wrong, you can correct me. And the same with other buildings. So I'm interested what functional type of buildings were more important for bearing national style than others?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think partly you are right. Sanatoriums didn't show like the national element of the architecture. However, in some sanatorium designs, there were some like designs that included these national style roofs and so on, but they have never won the competitions and they were never implemented. Sanatorium, I think, mostly are like based in this modern principles, because it have to be really, really rational and to work for the patient. But this like academic style and references to manorial architecture, somehow it seems like Latvians really like the classical architecture, because the functionalism and modern architecture in this interwar period was never like clearly functionalist, clearly modern. It was mostly like a blend with everything, and sometimes even the national style. For example, Pauls Kunziņš, he is very well known for his like national romanticist type, and there were a lot of elements in like public buildings sometimes, but mostly, of course, in the residential buildings.
And I would like to address the same question to other people sitting here, because you touched some type of the buildings, talking about the national style, the implementation of national style in architecture. And you already...
I would like to continue, because in Czechoslovakia we usually associate the national style with a few iconic buildings, for instance the crematorium in Pardubice, but that's the case that only a few of them were built. There were launched dozens of competitions in the early 1920s, usually won by a limited group of those members of a Janák circle. And many of them were designed in the national style, but because the resources were limited, only a few of them were built. But as it was a real movement, this style continued to be copied by upcoming generation of Janák and Gočár students, who developed this style further in late 1920s in small towns, where they usually designed some local schools or municipalities. So it became a real style, although the initiators, as Janák and Gočár, left it by the half of 1920s. So we cannot associate the national style with some typology. It was only the lack of other commissions that we reduced the style on those buildings.
But could we associate the national style with different forms? According to Matthew?
Just in answer to the question, I was going to say, I don't think you can't talk about specific types of buildings being more prone. That's what you mean, isn't it? You know, and I suppose, obviously, public buildings where you have public authorities have a vested interest, perhaps. But I think you can't really talk about specific types of buildings being more likely to be in the national style. I mean, given that obviously, as Vendela showed, that the rather strange Adria Palace, which is actually by a private company, whereas the crematoria obviously are kind of local regional authorities or especially with the church as well.
It was usually private association for crematoria together with the local authority.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got different kinds of bodies. So I guess you probably in each case, rather than asking, I suppose, a rather traditional kind of architectural historical question about typology, you just have to ask about who was the commission, who was actually commissioning the work. That's probably the more relevant question to ask in one sense.
Yeah, but perhaps anyway we should talk about the so-called symbolic buildings. For instance, Matt Kahn showed us a few examples of the most important palaces of the state, representing the state itself, and Estonian parliament.
Well, yes, obviously, I suppose, yeah, sure, but not necessarily, because it depends how the state wants to see itself as well, because if you have a state that wants to project an image of itself as not being national, as being kind of cosmopolitan, then quite clearly that doesn't quite work in the same way. So.
Well, in the Czechoslovak context, since late 1920s, it developed further, and we usually tend to associate Czechoslovakia with functionalism. But there is a gap between the official style of all those hospitals and ministry buildings in Prague that are more neoclassical, also the city hall, in comparison to the competition to parliament buildings that took place in 1928. And all first three awarded designs were in international style. So it was like a break. And it was in the same time as in Brno took place the exhibition of the contemporary culture. So 1928, like the 10 years of existence of independent country, was a certain point, but still there were many other buildings in neoclassical style that represented the official Czechoslovakia too.
In Estonian case, to express national spirit, you need to have something outstanding, glorious from your past. But in the case of Estonia, you don't have anything. So all historical styles are associated with your oppressors. So to be one version to be a nationalist was to be the most modern, and probably the Estonian Parliament House with its expressionism is a good example of it. But with this governance Latvian sanatoria, I was thinking that you can't have, in the case of sanatoria, a national form, because these TB sanatoria were very sad places, because the people they are sick, they can't be cured properly, they are just waiting their death. It was a situation with TB until the antibiotics were taken into use. So they were so sad places. How you can associate your national forms with this? Because for national forms, you must be optimistic and future-looking, etc. That's in my mind, simple reason why not to have, in the case of sanatoria, the national form.
Yes, that could be definitely the case, because, of course, sanatoriums were like places of isolation, also because to the disease not to spread, and also, of course, like the place where the patients could like wait till the end of their days, in some way.
Well, I just wanted to add one thing, which is, I think it is really important just to emphasise that the idea of what the national meant, there wasn't, I mean, the idea of a national style is problematic in as much as it assumes you know what the nation means. And I think obviously what Vendela, talking about Tiger and his opposition to Janag, clearly it's a very good illustration of conflicts of interpretation of what the nation even means, and I do think that has to be emphasised, because there's been obviously an awful lot of literature about the search for the national style. What there hasn't been so much of is the question of the huge conflicts between different interpretations of what is even being of even the past. Interpretations of what is that national past? What are those heroic events? And that tends to sometimes be elided, I think, or overlooked. I think in the literature, just focusing on questions of style or whatever. Definitely.
We had two almost two different styles, as you saw. So rationalism and neoclassicism, but the difference was not so clear. And I think that the most interesting things that Mussolini pushed to create a real national architectural style, but I think he didn't realize it. We have good luck.
So,
sorry, after these 3 lectures on Czech architecture, I have a feeling that we are on the Czechoslovakian seminar and not on the Baltic seminar, but I have to do one remark. I think it is not correct to say that the exhibition in Brno was going parallel with the erection of ministries in Prague. The competition for embankment of Vltava, Moldau River was organized 1920, won by Engel, by Hipschmann and Reuth. They built these ministries. Of course, the process of building of these ministries was longer till the beginning of 30s, and the competition for the Brno Fair was 1924. The building of the Brno Fair was from 1926 to 1928, and the breaking point was the appearance of the journal Život, edited by Krejcar, where Krejcar translated manifestos of Le Corbusier, and then also trips of Janák School and Gočár School in spring 1924 to Holland, and then came back and started to leave national style and to build in bricks the urban fabric of New Hradec Králové, for instance, Gočár, and also Janák is villas in Ořechovka Garden City. So I think this is an important moment.
Thank you for your comment, but I meant there is a basic misunderstanding, because I mentioned competition for the parliament building on Letna, which was in 1928. 28. And that's the same time as the Brno exhibition, which that's the turning point in the official tool of expressing Czechoslovakia through modern forms. I know that the development from national style to international style was gradual and was affected by the students of Janák and Gočár. But this year, 1928, was the open proclamation of Czechoslovakia that wants to represent itself in the modern forms of international style.
They celebrated themselves it was a manifest of modernism for Czechoslovakia.
That's what I'm saying. And I just wanted to say that Czechoslovakia also used other vocabulary in building the ministerial buildings on the embankment. So there are like two trends, which also Taiga declared in his chart, that there were different streams in the development.
But it was also caused by generation difference, because Reuth, Hipschmann and Engel, they had been born 1878, 1779, and Krejcar, Fuchs, etc., they were born 1895, so there was 15.
Of course, I just didn't want to go that deep into the Czech context here.
It's getting interesting.
Thank you. The question that I've got is to do with the vernacular. We heard a little bit about it from Mark's talk, but I'm interested in the vernacular, which is obviously a very problematic concept, because and I'd be interested to know what terms are used in other languages, but it obviously comes from the Latin. It means a slave, a domestic slave. But in an interesting way, it relates to national identity emerging out of an imperial context, because of course one could claim the vernacular as a way of saying that's the way of overthrowing, it's a symbolic gesture of overthrow of the master. And of course modernism sometimes aligns itself with vernacular buildings, especially I think towards the 1930s. But the vernacular also of course presents inherent problems in terms of state building, because it tends to be identified with the rural, it tends to be identified with the pre-modern, it tends to be identified with the domestic. So I wanted to hear more from each of you really about examples that you've heard of where the vernacular is identified with the modern and with national identity.
If I can again go to the Czech context. Vernacular was very inspirational source for this generation of architects, because the official historical styles as Baroque and Gothic or Renaissance, although they were pre-existing in the Czech lands for 100 years, for centuries, still since the 17th century it was perceived as also the tool of oppression, because then the German nobility came and they were designing their palaces and castles in these styles. So they were not accepted as Czech in their origin. And that was the reason why the architects returned to the folk culture, which was meant like the real cradle of Czech identity, which was pure in its origin, although it was everything copying the higher culture.
Can I say so? Is it on? Yes, it is, isn't it? You've kind of highlighted an issue which I think was very specific about, a lot of Central and Eastern Europe, which was this conflation of the vernacular with the national, and that goes back to the 1870s, 1880s, when folk art, the discourses of folk art, and folk art ceases to be identified in terms of a rural class or vernacular, in the way that you allude to, and it becomes tied up with myths about the countryside being the locus of national identity, and so that's why often the terms national and vernacular often end up becoming conflated, precisely because of that slippage. Because and I mean, you go back to the people like Riegel in the Vienna School are debating this as well, as because folk art originally was defined as simply the art produced by people in villages. But obviously the meaning of the word folk itself became very problematic, and there's a slippage there. And interestingly, you also have different debates about the relationship between high art and vernacular art, so that although on the one hand Wendell says there was a kind of discourse, saying that championing the vernacular because official high art was a tool of the oppressors, but at the same time there were plenty of people saying, well, actually vernacular art is just a kind of, it's a copying, it's a debased version of high art forms, so that you then have, the emergence of things like folk baroque, for example, which is just seen as this peasant version and borrowing, 150, 200 years after the event of official baroque style. So that it becomes a very problematic term, I think, just because you get these different categories ending up becoming quite slippery, and they're interpreted in different ways for different purposes, and behind that is obviously a wider question of class politics, and the place of the people, and how that's defined within wider kind of discourses of national identity. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's kind of, that's what's there but in the background, I think.
In the case of Estonia, you probably can associate with vernacular, although we don't use vernacular word in this context, but you can do it with this 1920s traditionalism, this building masters architecture. But because this is bound with local traditions, but it's not directly folk or farm architecture. The second place where you can associate with vernacular are these standard designs by architects for the new farmhouses, but such a Heimatkunst evaluation of local traditions is there important. They both, Baltic German Jacobi and his young Estonian followers, they both write that the farm architecture was spoiled by Art Nouveau and historicism and cheap industrial devices, and now we restore the real bridge to the good earlier traditions of old farm architecture. Although they at the same time they have a corner windows and other modernist details there included. But something as good, the modernism together with vernacular, like, sorry, I see some Finnish colleagues there, like Erik Brugman's chapel in Turku or so, we don't have.
No, just no, I think that in Italy we have.
Try again.
Okay. No, I think that in Italy we have always the same problem. So it's the relation with the antiquity, and this is the big problem we had, and we had always in modernism period. Rationalists as the neoclassicist has the same problem. So it's more relevant than the vernacular one. So I think this is the central point of Italian architectural.
Yeah, but if we switch on to the design issues, so there was a very big interest to ethnology and this countryside heritage in Italy as well during 20s.
Yes, I agree.
So the influence of arts and crafts in Italy was really strong.
Yes, was really strong. Yes, it is. That's so.
Architecture, you mean it's another issue?
But I think it's not so relevant. So, as the problem with the relation with Okay. We have to organize an art conference.
Vernacular.
Yes.
I think in Latvia, vernacular often means national, because in the 30s, and especially in the time of authoritarian regime by Kārlis Ulmanis, there was a discourse between architects about what is a national style, and some of them said that it's anything Latvian architect is designing. It could be modern, it could be classicist, it could be vernacular or national or anything. But on the same time, in this period, the most significant were the neoclassicist style. And somehow maybe in kind of like propaganda element in that, but architect Ežens Laube, he became like the court architect of the time, and he was of course clear classicist with sometimes some elements of modernism, sometimes some elements of nationalism, but he was mostly like academic and classicist architecture lover.
Thanks. We have one question. Okay. My name is Maria Sołtysik. I came from Poland, Gdynia. I would like to refer to the terms national modernisms and international modernisms. Some years, 10 years ago, in the literature, historic literature, the term international modernism was really broadly used. Nowadays, we discovered so many national modernisms, so that the term international modernism is in retreat. We tend to use functional architecture. I have the question whether really the term international modernism is still valid, and what is the difference between the international and international style and functionalism, and whether the international style we should use something like is something like international style, and what is it?
Thank you very much. Who was that?
Thank you for the question. The universal aspects of functionalism, they have studied so thoroughly that they don't look anymore so exciting. To discover all the local context and to contextualize modernism in different situations is much more exciting at the moment.
I guess also there's an issue with international modernism where there's a kind of danger of it being part of a sort of teleological narrative of, kind of the march towards progress and so forth, and it was there implicit in that chart that Wendler showed of Tiger, that somehow, and I guess that's why, the term international modernism has these kind of overtones which make it slightly problematic, because we actually know that the meaning of modernism, it just meant so many different things in different places. The meaning of modernity itself, and I suppose that's the key thing as well, just regarding it as some kind of style, I think is a gross simplification as well. So I think it is a problematic term, even though quite clearly you see all sorts of architects, allying themselves with Siam and wanting to be part of something which is quite clearly an international, community and a practice, but nevertheless it does have all these kind of problematic aspects to it, I think, and associations which perhaps may explain what you mean.
Yeah, it's a kind of a universal language, but each country, each region has its own development with own names.
I guess we have time for 2 questions, 2 short questions. I don't see anything.
I had one question for, first of all, for Mart, but probably for other speakers as well. And the question comes from Kaunas, of course, context and with national issue. And for me, I think it's very important that this national style, at least in Kaunas, it comes with decorative elements. And if you remember this that modernism somehow is connected with ornament is a crime, this famous essay. So, do you think that there is a kind of tendency that ornament is not a crime in Kaunas, and can you compare it in a wider context? First of all, of course, in Latvia, Estonia, but maybe even wider if someone else would answer it as well.
Of course, there was not much avant-garde architecture, not at all avant-garde architecture in politics, and this radicalism of new avant-garde was too much for these places, and they prefer to adopt modernism, to have their own modernity, which aesthetically is less radical, and the buildings should be more beautiful according to the local taste. And what we see quite often that I don't know good examples in Kaunas, but what I can say about Estonia, that especially the industrialists who wanted to show how much they are progressive. They offer jobs, they produce some new type of products, they do plastics already, or this type of early type of plastics already, or they have modern new branches in industry, they modernize the whole society, and their villas, they must be functionalist. But at the same time, they feel that if I am totally functionalist, how I can show my richness? The richness must be also shown in understandable way, and then you need some kind of decor, so that your guests understand you. So there must be a communication, and because of this communication reasons, some kind of decor is still needed to adapt the modernity to its viewers, to its users.
Satisfied. And I have a short question to Matthew. Hussite churches, they were all built in this international modernism or functionalism style?
No.
So you made a selection?
I made a selection, yes, as we all
And
do, to give a story that somebody else would then probably disagree with. But no, I mean, and obviously, I mean, as I said, this just very beginning of this was kind of, in a way, a sort of set of intuitions about, you know, but I suppose what I'm just really trying to do is just kind of shake up a certain kind of narrative, you know, about Czechoslovakia, about its relationship to what modernity meant, you know, which I mean, and it's part of a kind of there's been a larger there was a very provocative book a few years ago published called Czechoslovakia, the State That Failed, and it sort of is deliberately kind of iconoclastic, saying far from being the kind of great, you know, beacon of liberal democracy in Central Europe, actually, you know, it fell apart because of failures of governance and mistreatment of minorities and so forth. And so it's part of a kind of general revisiting of as I said, certain kind of myths of state identity, in which the you know, the role of the church, you know, was well, either it was a very selective inclusion, including even, you know, figures like Hus, the meaning of Jan Hus and others, as part of that sort of state mythologizing. But no, I mean, obviously they weren't all functionalists either, or international modernism, or whatever you might want to call it.
I had a suspicion. Thank you very much. So now we have a break, and Padeda will explain your.
Yes, I have some technical announcements. So thank you first of all for being here.